Okay, this is my first live ever. This is definitely new to me, but I am committed to try to put myself out there and learn how to speak uh, more comfortably, privately, and all that jazz. So, what I'm going over today is actually PCI DSS requirements. I'm going over the first one, really just reading over notes, but I want to share it um, as my way of teaching it so I can learn myself, get better, and in turn possibly help anyone else who's on their journey for learning the PCI DSS the PCI DSS framework. For those of you who do not know, PCI DSS stands for Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. Pretty much, it's a cybersecurity framework that's created to prevent companies from being out of compliance um, for for anything and anyone that handles credit cards or payment cards. So I guess I could try that explanation again because that was a little weird. Um, PCI DSS is the cybersecurity framework for any company that uses payment cards across the board. It's a framework that if companies are not in compliance with, they are potentially at risk to get fined millions of dollars. So learning it and being able to articulate it is very beneficial, not just for myself, income-wise, but for the company as well. Um, Trying to get away from any fines or fees like that. So PCI DSS framework requirement one. There are a total of 12, and I will do my very, very best to continue forward with putting these out there if they help you out. Whether or not they help you out, it's not going to matter, honestly, because I'm doing this to help myself learn. But at the same time, if it helps you all learn, great. Don't mind the mess in the back. Okay, PCI DSS requirement one. 1.1.1 states that all network connections and changes to firewalls and router configurations require a formal approving and testing process. So everything has to be approved ahead of time. What you will direct the company to do based off 1.1.1.a is to examine the documented procedures to verify a formal process for testing and approval of all one, network connections, and two, changes to the firewall and router configurations. So documented procedures, that's the most important part. If it's not documented, then it didn't happen, and those procedures would then cause that company to be out of compliance because it's not within a company policy. 1.1.1.b is about requesting a list of all network changes done to the organization to collect a sample of network connections. So either you'd have to interview a sysadmin or a net admin to verify ticket numbers. For example, this is an example. You get some ticket numbers from the company, and then you go ahead and view about 8 of them. You determine those changes have been approved by someone in leadership according to that company's rules and responsibilities. And then you're able to determine there as a sample if the rest of them most likely have been reviewed correctly. 1.1.1.c, you want to identify sample of changes compared to the change records, and then interview and verify again. So it's a lot of reiteration with these sub processes or sub requirements. The next one is 1.1.2. Current network diagrams need to reflect all connections between the CDE or the cardholder data environment and any other networks, including wireless networks. So when it comes to the cardholder data environment, this is the environment of network connections and devices that are going to be using that are going to be having any of the data, cardholder data. So in other words, at a business, a POS being a point of sale system, that system and any computers holding data from the cardholders are going to be considered part of the CDE. And of course, you don't want to have any wireless networks that aren't a part of that system to be connected for the sake of security. 1.1.2.a, you want to examine those diagrams and observe the network configurations to verify that the current network diagram exists and it documents all the connections to cardholder data, including wireless. That's corporate networks, cloud environments, all of that. 1.1.2.b is about interviewing the responsible personnel to verify the diagram kept current. Now, moving on to 1.1.3, sounds very similar because it's stating current diagram needs to show data flow across systems and networks. So data flow is different than just the diagram itself. In this data flow diagram, you want to examine the data flow and interview the personnel that administered it or created it, and make sure it's current and up to date. So the flow is one thing of the data, but actual network diagram will have a lot more details like routers, switches, servers, databases, all that. So there's a difference from those two. Some people get confused. And in case you're wondering, I took my own notes of what the PCI DSS requirement number 1 is, and I'm just reviewing them with you. So as a summary, what I learned is that if any diagrams or configuration procedures are not documented, then it didn't happen and it would leave the company non-compliant. Okay. 1.1.4 states that the requirement of firewall at each internet connection and between any DMZ or demilitarized zone and the internal network zone. So I'm gonna have to look at the network diagram to see if there are any any firewalls at those internet connections. 1.1.4.a, examine firewall config standards and verify that it includes a firewall at each internet connection and between the DMZ and internal network. So in a network, you have your internet router where everything routes out to the internet websites and all that other stuff. But from the other side, you have your external router or your perimeter router. And then you need to have a firewall between that router and your demilitarized zone. And even then, you need to also have another firewall between that demilitarized zone and your internal network, another layer of security. In security, specifically IT security, it's all about layers. No one solution is going to be a fit-all solution. It's not going to do what it needs. It'll do what it needs to do, but it won't do enough, especially with hackers and threat actors just taking advantage of vulnerabilities and exploiting them across all sorts of devices. One layer of security is not going to be enough. See. 1.1.4.b, of course, verify those current net diagrams are consistent with the firewall configurations. You got to ask yourself, is this diagram consistent with this firewall configuration, with what the standard is saying? A simple yes or no. 1.1.4.c, observe network configurations to verify that the firewall is in place and that the internet connections and between the DMZ and the internal network zone are documented in that configuration standard for the company policy. Moving on to 1.1.5, a description of groups, roles, and responsibilities for the management of network components. So 1.1.5.a states that you need to verify the firewall and router configs standards are included in the description. 1.1.5.b, interview personnel again to verify the people responsible for the management of those network components, just to confirm those roles and responsibilities that are assigned as documented. 1.1.6, this here I've learned is the most important requirement. and it's because it's specific to the ports, protocols, and the services that are utilized on each system within the CDE in a merchant's network. So documentation of business justification and approval for use of all services, protocols, and ports allowed, including documentation of security features that are implemented for these protocols considered to be insecure. Moving on to 1.1.6.a, you want to verify that the firewall and router configuration standards include the documented list of all services, protocols, and ports, including business justification and approval for each. 1.1.6.b, identify those insecure services, protocols, and ports allowed, and then verify that those security features are documented for each service. When it comes to firewalls, the whole idea is to prevent what you want to prevent and to allow what you need to allow. Of course, it's not always cut dry like that when it comes to cybersecurity, but having certain rules in place to prevent traffic from outside and prevent internal traffic from going outside, data exfiltration, are all part of what a firewall will help to accomplish. 1.1.6.c, examine those, it's the same thing really. Examine those firewall and router configurations to verify documented security features are implemented for each insecure service, protocol, and port. So it's a bunch of re-verification and verification that it is done, not just that it was documented in the company policy, but somebody is doing it and somebody is aware of how it works. Let's see, 1.1.7. The requirement states that you need to review firewall and router rule sets at least every 6 months. Now, as a PCI DSS framework, this is not, there's a lot more that you can do to harden or secure down your systems. This is a minimum. So every 6 months is a minimum, but definitely highly recommended more often and more frequent than that. 1.1.7a states you want to verify those router configurations and firewall configurations. Do review those rule sets every 6 months. 1.1.7.b, again, examine documentation relating to the rule set. Review and interview responsible parties to verify they've reviewed every 6 months. The intent is, of course, to look for rules that need to be cleaned up every 6 months, but that are still there. Sometimes a company will have certain rule sets set up to maybe allow a particular port, service, or protocol for a service that they had and they were using for a good while, but something changed. Well, they can't just leave that open because now that's a vulnerability. They need to close what they're not utilizing. And that's why checking every 6 months to make sure any of those that are needing to be closed down are closed down and not remaining open. Requirement 1.2, build those firewall and router configurations that restrict connections between untrusted networks and any system components in the cardholder data environment. This is just reiterating again, but from a different, more of a very specific or explicitly saying to do this. 1.2, examine, it's the same thing, but they have it as a sub-process. Examine those, perform the following to verify connections are restricted and untrusted networks and system components in the CDE. 1.2.1, restrict any inbound and outbound traffic to which is necessary for the CDE and specifically deny all other traffic. Like I mentioned before, it's the exact same thing, just gotta make sure it's done. Okay. 1.2.1.a. Examine firewall and router configurations to verify that they identify any inbound and outbound traffic that is necessary for the CDE. Reiteration again, 1.2.1.b. It's the same thing. 1.2.1.c, examine firewall and router configurations to verify all other inbound and outbound traffic is specifically denied. And here comes my boy. Yes.
Can I push my iPad for a little bit until it dies?
You can try, but I think it's already dead.
Let's see.
Yep, it's dead already. I can charge it. Here.
What could I do now?
You can go back into the room and play some more.
Well, my game has died also.
It died also?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Sorry. Let's find something to do out there, okay? Until I'm done here, and then I can come out and help you.
I'm gonna find something like watching or playing.
No, that's not finding anything. That's just watching. That's mind numbing. You're not going to learn anything. Don't be upset. Come on. Go into the living room, and I'll be there soon.
I know that Blippi Blippi says the song about he learned some. When we learn about him, we shout Blippi.
Yeah, you didn't learn anything there except for marketing.
No, learning about ice cream.
Okay. Go ahead, kid. I'm busy right now. Okay. I'll be there in a minute.
Can I have a snack, Daddy?
Not right now.
Why?
Because I'm still busy.
Can I get? No, I.
Wish there was a way to pause this recording. Okay. Sorry about that. Where was I? I know a lot of these sounded like they're just repetition. I know that there's very specific sub-requirements that do need to be given attention to. I want to put that out there, not saying that, oh, just the same thing, just ignore it. That you definitely don't ignore it. It's just in copying these down and writing them down, I learned that a lot of them are just repetition. It's more of like, here's the requirement, here's what you need to verify of the requirement, and then and this, of course, just make sure you are verifying the requirement with the person interviewing them. That's what it seems to be consistently throughout these sub requirements, but I will still go over them to make sure that I'm covering everything. I think I left off at 1.2.1.b. Examine those firewall and router configs to verify inbound and outbound traffic is limited to what is necessary for a CDE. 1.2.1.c. Examine firewall and router configurations to verify all other inbound and outbound traffic is specifically denied. For example, by using an explicit deny all rule or an implicit deny after there is an allow statement, that would do exactly what you need. Now, if you don't know these kind of commands, they're commands that you typically will see in a router or a firewall to allow or deny any traffic. 1.2.2, secure and synchronize router configuration files. 1.2.2.a, examine those router configuration files to verify that they are secured from unauthorized access. You want to verify that they're using some form of authentication mechanism, whether that is TACACS or local accounts. The net admin will have to log in and configure that firewall. 1.2.2.b, verify that this router configuration file is running or active, and that it matches up with the startup config when the machines are then booted. Because if you don't save, you go and change something to disallow a certain port or service from being open, and then you just close it down or reboot it and not save it, then the startup configuration will not be saved into memory, because the running config is saved in NVRAM, non-volatile RAM. So any changes that are made to this and are saved there, if those changes are not saved, the router will reboot without the configuration and it'll need to be redone. So it needs to be committed to memory. Moving on to 1.2.3, make sure you install perimeter firewalls between wireless and CDE, wireless networks and the CDE, and configure those firewalls to deny, or if traffic is necessary for business purposes, permit only the authorized traffic between the wireless environment and that CDE. As a note, just put the firewalls between wireless networks and CDE. It's the best way to get it. You cannot have unsecured networks directly connected to a CDE without a firewall in front of it. Requirement 1.3, prohibited direct public access between internet and any system component in the CDE. 1.3 is all about examining those firewall and router configs again. Of course, doing this, the guidance is that although legitimate reasons are in existence for things like a web server being permitted to the DMZ, such connections should never be allowed or granted to systems within the internal network. And that's the main thing. That's the main reason for those firewalls and the rules on the routers. And even the DMZ itself is a space between the internal network and external network or the internet. 1.3.1, you want to implement the DMZ to limit inbound traffic to only system components that provide authorized public accessible services, protocols, and ports. You want to, again, examine those configs to verify that the DMZ is implemented to limit inbound to only system components that provide authorized public accessible services, protocols, and ports. 1.3.2, limit that inbound traffic to IP addresses within the DMZ. Moving forward to 1.3.3, talks a little bit more about why that's a need to prevent things like anti-spoofing. You want to implement, to prevent things like spoofing. And to prevent that, you want to implement anti-spoofing measures to detect and block any forged source IP addresses from entering the network. In other words, block traffic from the internet as its origin, and then within it, anything coming externally from the internet with an internal source address. Hackers have gotten really good at being able to spoof the source address to make it look like it's coming from an IP address within the network. And so these are anti-spoofing measures that will help prevent that. Make sure you're using RFC 1918 IP addresses, which is just internal IP addresses. Okay, last page of my notes, and then I'll leave you all alone. 1.3.4, don't allow unauthorized outbound traffic from the CDE to the internet. Why? Data exfiltration. I mentioned this earlier. 1.3.5 says permit only established connections to the network, only allow known and established and nothing else. You want to ensure that these firewalls have stateful inspection, where the TCP connection has been established and it's done. Then that'll allow the communication to follow through. 1.3.6, place components storing cardholder databases in an internal network segregated from the DMZ and other untrusted networks, part of the whole network architecture. 1.3.7, do not disclose private IP addresses and routing information to unauthorized parties. As part of that, 1.3.7.a, specific examples would include NAT, which is network address translation. And this is pretty much where everyone on the internet has an IP address, a public IP address for their homes, places of work. But not everyone has not every IP address that you use inside of your network is a public IP address, because then that would mean anybody from the outside in the internet anywhere could just simply access your computer right straight away. In order for, well, there's several reasons. One, there's several reasons that NAT exists. One big reason is to prevent running out of IP addresses, because there's so many people using IP addresses. IPv4 has been pretty much exhausted almost, and IPv6 is what has been introduced. But before IPv6 came out, we were using NAT, and we still are, because it also provides a sense of privacy and security. A collected pool of IP addresses that are considered private IP addresses would be within my home network. And then they're all attached to this one public IP address, which is what would represent me across the internet. And that's the way it works. You know, very, very simplified, but that's how it works. Servers need to be behind proxy servers and other firewalls. Any removal or filtering of route advertisements, like Cisco Neighbor that employ registered addressing, and then any internal use of RFC 1918 private space addresses instead of registered addresses, public, right? Like I mentioned before. 1.4 says you want to install personal firewall software or equivalent functionality on any portable computing device, including company and or employee owned that connect to the internet when outside the network, like BYOD, bring your own device. You want to verify that these personal firewalls are running, antivirus, Norton, etc., and then just make sure that that is done. That's the requirement. You got to ask yourself though, how is it that these companies can then protect from employee-owned devices? They can't necessarily require that you put a certain app or restriction on your device. It's your personal device. Other than just the company deciding we're not going to have a BYOD policy, a bring your own device policy, because that's too much of a risk for us as a company. They could do that. That's a lot safer and faster. Instead, they might implement a technical control like Cisco ICE, which is Cisco's version of a network access control, a NAC. And that would allow security in the form of any device that signs onto the network will first be evaluated to make sure that it is secure. It could be for very different, like it could have a whole bunch of different requirements to look through before it actually is allowed on the network. So let's say you're trying to connect to the network. This NAC will go ahead and scan. Sorry, give me just a second. Okay, sorry about that. I was speaking about the network access control, giving you an example of how that works. So you sign on to the network, or you want to sign on to the network. Instead of just getting straight access to the network, what will happen is the NAC will kind of not quarantine your device, but in a way quarantine it and then start running scans on it to determine, for example, a rule could be, do you have an antivirus installed on your device? Yes, you do. Okay, good. Do you have a personal firewall like this requirement is stating? Yes, you do. Okay. Do you have, I don't know, a specific app, like maybe a VPN client installed on your device? No, you don't? Oh, okay. Well, that is one of the 3 requirements that we need you to have on that device in order for you to have access to this network internally. So because you don't have that 3rd one, you're not going to be given access, and then you don't have access. If all those 3 were met, then you'd be granted access to that internal network because the NAC would have determined you are safe and will keep us safe if we allow you in. So a NAC is a very good technical control to implement for that requirement. And moving on to the last requirement of this the last sub requirement of the requirement 1.5. You want to ensure that these security policies and operational procedures for managing firewalls are documented in use and known to all affected parties. That kind of goes without saying, going across all of them and seeing how that's something that you need to do to verify each time. But this one obviously needs to be explicitly pointed out, stating that you got to make sure it's not just documented, make sure it's in use, but also it's known to all of the affected parties. Because if they don't know about it, it's pretty pointless. Well, I have finished the end of these requirements and sub-requirements. You might have learned something from this. You might have not. You probably just felt like I was rambling and rambling, which I kind of was. I'm not very good on camera. This is my first time. But I hope that you have a wonderful day, and I will see you guys next time. God bless.